Doc Cain, the first Gulf War, the global war on terrorism, West Point, medical school, 3rd Ranger Battalion, 1st Ranger Battalion, OEF, OIF, trauma surgeon. This is a short list of events that Dr. Jeff Cain has been a part of. This guy is incredible. In addition to all the ways he serves, gives back, and educates, and his full-time job as an emergency room physician in Dallas, Doc Cain also serves as the medical director for the ALERRT program. This guy is a crazy wealth of knowledge and has brought us along. I was lucky enough to steal a few minutes of his free time and discuss some of his views and experiences. I hope you enjoy this exchange. Let's roll this and see how it goes. Episode 3, The Call. All right. So welcome to the podcast. Our podcast is called The Call. We are running this podcast from the TTPOA conference in Dallas, Texas. This is April 2021. So we're going to sit down today with Dr. Jeff Cain, who is the medical director for the ALERRT program, Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training, the ALERRT program in San Marcos, Texas. And we're going to do a little discussion about pre-hospital medicine and the changes along the way. So I want to introduce myself. My name is Eddie Molina. I am the Southeast Regional Manager for the ALERRT program. I came out of San Antonio, Texas. I was a San Antonio police officer for 25 years with some special operations and some covert operations experience. So I'll be doing the interview. I'm going to have my partner, Casey, if you want to introduce yourself, Casey.
I'm Casey Williams. I'm the e-learning program manager for ALERRT. I have over 20 years law enforcement experience in the Dallas area, and I'm happy to be here.
And I'm going to let our guest, our medical director, introduce himself. Jeff?
Hey, thank you, Eddie. Jeff Cain. I'm a board-certified emergency medicine physician. Started off life, I have probably 24 years in the military. Started off as an infantry officer. Had an opportunity to switch and go to medical school shortly after Somalia. Did emergency medicine residency, went back into the Army, right into an operational unit. So I spent the first couple of years of the war with 1st Ranger Battalion, with 2 rotations in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. Had to heal up after Iraq and was the educational medical director for the Combat Medic Schoolhouse in Fort Sam Houston. Did that for a couple of years, getting the Army Combat Medic program going, not going, but redirected into a more combat-focused combat medic as opposed to a clinical-focused medic. And did some research with the U.S. Army Institute of Research and finished up my Army career there. I've been practicing civilian emergency medicine here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, predominantly up in McKinney and Plano area, since 2008. And I've also had opportunities to do some tactical medical direction for various units, McKinney, Plano, Frisco, their SWAT teams and their tactical teams. I'm also currently the medical director for the Task Order 2 embassy security personnel out of Baghdad.
It's a pretty extensive bio, pretty extensive resume you've built up. So did you grow up in Texas?
No, unfortunately I didn't. Can't choose where you're born. I was born in the state of Illinois, not the northern part of Illinois, which has corrupted the rest of the state. I grew up in corn, soybean country on a farm. Went to high school there, graduated several years ago, right, 1983, with my small high school class. And actually my class was the largest that had been graduated from that facility in many years. I was one of 22 graduating people.
Wow.
From there, I spent a year at the University of Illinois on the Air Force, on the Air Force's dime with an ROTC scholarship, and realized that since I wasn't going to be able to be part of a flight program because of my eyesight, there was not a whole lot else that really interested me in the Air Force. And nobody there told me anything about any of the special operations components of Air Force because nobody knew anything about the special operations component. So I made an effort to do something different and was afforded the opportunity to go to West Point. And I've been an Army guy ever since.
Wow, West Point. That's pretty prestigious, pretty rare. It's pretty, maybe not rare, but it's a hard thing to do. Hard thing to get into, number one. The process is long. Who was your sponsor? How did you get the appointment?
Again, this is several years ago, and so I got an appointment. Again, I'm a small town kid from Central Illinois. My parents are not well connected. You know, they're farmers, paying their taxes, barely making ends meet. So we have no political clout whatsoever. And really, the only people in my family that had served in the military at all was my maternal grandfather, who was an Army aircraft mechanic in World War II. And that was pretty much the extent of what I knew about the military, except for talking to some friends that had, enlisted in the Marines or enlisted in the Army. So I took what I had done in high school through all the leadership stuff that I had participated in. I had good grades. I was a pretty good student. I was a pretty good athlete. Not stellar, but good enough to be competitive. And at the time, I was afforded a nomination from Dan Rostenkowski, who at the time was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee out of Illinois. I was fortunate. I was given an opportunity. The taxpayers afforded me a great opportunity, and hopefully they've gotten a good return on their investment. Awesome.
That's a very historic place that you got to go to school at. And I know you don't mention that right away. You kind of skipped past that, so I kind of did a little homework on you. So I wanted to hear that story. So where's your ring? What do y'all do with your rings?
Most people wear them. Right. Mine is in my safe deposit box at home. I don't wear it frequently, and it's not because I'm not proud of my institution. I am a fantastic institution. The education that I was afforded there was by far and away better than anything that I could have done on my own with my level of discipline at the time. And really, it essentially afforded me the opportunity to do two things. Number one, secure my primary goal, which was to secure commission into the Army, into the infantry, and I was able to do that. I graduated from West Point with a degree in international relations with a concentration on the Soviet Union. As you can tell, that's probably not really marketable these days. But that education allowed me 6 years later, when I graduated from West Point, I had no interest in medicine. I wanted to be kicking doors and shooting people in the face and breaking things that needed to be broken in the name of our country's national interest. At some point, I changed and had an opportunity to do medicine. And even though my background and my degree was in international relations, all I really had to do to complete my prerequisites was to do essentially 2 semesters in organic chemistry and 2 semesters in biology, biochemistry, and that completed all the prerequisites that I needed to be competitive for medical school. So it was a great opportunity. And just a fantastic lineage. But I don't want people to define me based on my background, based on where I went to school. I want them to make an opinion of me based on our interactions.
Absolutely.
And so I think that, when you wear a ring that is defined by an institution, sometimes you carry biases, either positive biases or negative biases that can be perceived. I would rather that you create your own biases after you meet me and interact with me, rather than a preconceived notion of this guy is very regimented in thinking, this guy is strictly, right wing, this guy is definitely left wing, whatever it is. I want you to make your opinions of me based on our interactions and not by where I may have been socialized.
Well, nothing but respect for that decision. That's pretty cool. I like that. So, medicine. So how did you decide you were going to go into medicine? Where did you go to medical school at?
Once again, I was afforded a great opportunity from our taxpayers, and I was able to go to the America's Medical School, the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. It's a Department of Defense medical school out of Bethesda, Maryland. At the time that I was there, representatives predominantly from the Air Force, Navy, and the Army, but we also had 10 public health service physicians as well, who their primary charge is mostly with our Native American population as well as other indigent populations, underserved populations in the United States. Great group of folks. But what a fantastic education. I couldn't have planned it better. When you go to America's Medical School, you learn medicine. You don't learn a particular type of medicine. You don't learn Harvard medicine or Johns Hopkins medicine. You learn medicine. And you get to rotate through any different hospital system there is. You're not just going to the teaching hospital that's associated with your medical school. So you get associated with, or you get introduced to multiple tactics, techniques, procedures for doing medicine with the greatest bunch of people I could ever hope for. These are people that learned medicine and decided that they were going to invest into the infrastructure of the United States and decided to come on active duty for whatever reason, either to pay back loans because this is what they wanted to do. And that's where my passion was. And so I got to learn from some very, very phenomenal Americans.
That's pretty interesting. So I know I've heard you on a different show where you mentioned that you get to learn medicine. And there's obviously a big difference in the way you put that out there. It's obviously a big difference in learning just medicine or actual medicine. What's the biggest difference?
I think the biggest difference is understanding that there are many different ways to get to the same solution. And so when you talk about medicine, I think, one of my greatest mentors, a trauma surgeon by the name of Norm McSwain, was very fond of saying, don't confuse medical principles with a medical preference. And for example, if the principle is use a tourniquet to stop the bleeding, a preference may be to use a cat tourniquet to stop the bleeding or a soft T tourniquet to stop the bleeding. That's a preference, but you can stop the bleeding with any number of different resources, and you might not even need a tourniquet. Maybe you just need direct pressure, maybe need a hemostatic agent, maybe you need to go in and actually tie off a blood vessel. But if you learn the principle of what you're trying to accomplish, the preference should be just a tool at your disposal to help you accomplish that. And I think that a lot of times people get caught up when you're in a specific teaching institution or when you're in a specific teaching program that you learn very specific principles, but you also learn very specific preferences to get you to that principle. And when you go somewhere else, that principle or that preference may not be available to you. And if you don't know another way to solve your problem and you don't have the tool that you're most familiar with, you can learn, but the learning curve comes at the expense of the casualties that you're treating.
Wow. That's pretty in-depth, and you said a lot with that statement. So you go through medical school. Where's your first stop?
After medical school, I get fortunate enough to be selected to the emergency medicine residency in Fort Hood. So I did 3 years at Fort Hood. And then right out of there, I was afforded the opportunity to come back to the Ranger Regiment. And I was asked if I would be interested in being the 1st Ranger Battalion physician. And I said yes. And then I said, well, should I think about it? But I said, definitely. So right out of residency, I out-processed Fort Hood, took a couple of weeks leave, in-processed 1st Ranger Battalion in Savannah, Georgia. And that was in June, July of 2001.
Wow. All right. So I guess growing up, we all saw military movies. We saw the Army movies. We saw all that cool stuff. So growing up, we never saw the guys running around with their cool military gear, and there was not a whole bunch of vests being worn. There was not a whole bunch of fancy gear like there is now. So all the movies that we see now, we see the guys have tourniquets strapped to their shoulder. It's very obvious, and that's one of the processes we're teaching now. What was common when you first came out, when you first hit the ground, or when you first hit military medicine? What were we teaching at that point?
Well, we were teaching programs that were not vetted in any evidence-based medicine and not suited for our particular operational environment. So case in point, when I was an infantry officer, I was assessed and accepted into 3rd Ranger Battalion as an infantry officer in 1991. And at that time, the Ranger Regiment had already made an investment in training medical tasks down to the individual Ranger. So as a Ranger infantry guy, I was taught how to start IVs. And so all of us carried an IV start kit in the bottom outside pocket of our rucksack. So we had an IV start kit and a liter of fluid, and we were good, right? And we practiced starting IVs on everybody. This is 1991. The dirty little secret is that's a great medical task that requires training and sustainment, but unfortunately nobody's ever been saved. No, not a single life has been saved in trauma from starting an IV and running salt water in somebody's veins. So we hadn't really vetted our program. If you were really lucky back then and you were in a high-speed unit, let's say that you were in a Ranger Regiment or you were in the 82nd Airborne, Our first aid kit at the time consisted of what was then a compass pouch. So you had a small pouch that you carried a lensatic compass in. You had a second one of those that you had a trauma bandage in. And the trauma bandage that was the standard issue bandage for the United States Army had been developed in the Korean War. It was useless as a trauma bandage in the Korean War. It was useless as a bandage in Vietnam. It was useless as a bandage in Grenada. It was useless as a bandage in Panama. I have to keep going. It was useless in Desert Storm. But you still had this. This was our bandage because nobody attended to it, right? And nobody attended to what we needed to do with this bandage. But if you were in a high-speed unit, like the Ranger Regiment or, say, the 82nd, maybe the 10th Mountain Division, they gave you 2 of those bandages, and you shoved 2 of those bandages down in your pouch, and now you were good to go. That's what made you different. After the Battle of the Black Sea in 1993 in Mogadishu, after action, we did a very scathing after action review of ourselves. Because you can't get better if you don't understand where things were suboptimal.
So when you say you did a scathing after action of ourselves, who did this after action?
So it was combined, right? So it was the combined task force. So it was Task Force Ranger was a combined task force with all of our players there from the Joint Special Operations Command. And so those key stakeholders all took a part in looking at that particular and that particular battle for October 3rd, October 4th. We looked at that particular battle. We looked at not only the tactics, techniques, and procedures, but also the casualties and the casualty outcomes. And of the warriors that were killed that day, were there any that we could have saved? And if we could have saved them, what would have made a difference? Would it have been medical interventions? Would it have been better protection? What was it that could have saved a life? And we came away with several lessons learned, not the least of which is the medical program that we were subscribed to for how to provide care under hostile combat conditions was not the right way to do things. And 2 very far forward, far thinking individuals, Captain Frank Butler and Colonel John Hagman, Butler from the Navy, Special Operations side of the house, and Hagman from the Army, came together and wrote a landmark paper. In 1996, it was published in Military Medicine. The title was Tactical Combat Casualty Care for Special Operations Forces. And it outlined what we now know as the vetted program of Tactical Combat Casualty Care. Remember, this is 1996. So it was published in Military Medicine. So if you didn't read Military Medicine, you didn't really pick up on the article. Right. If you read Military Medicine and you looked at the title and it said Tactical Combat Casualty Care for Special Operations Forces, if you weren't part of Special Operations Forces, you're like, this probably doesn't apply to me. So you probably didn't read it. So this landmark article that actually looked at our operating environment and looked at what the requirements were, specifically for how people get injured and how people die in that environment, and of the deaths, what are those deaths that are potentially preventable where we can intervene in a timely manner to keep guys alive. It's a great program. These guys did their homework. They dug through military history. They dug through all of the evidence-based medicine that we could find, and we essentially turned pre-hospital care in combat on its head. You know, when I was a young infantry ranger, we were taught to use a tourniquet, but we were told if you put a tourniquet on somebody, man, I'm going to tell you what, that better be the last thing you do, because if you put a tourniquet on somebody's arm or leg, they're going to lose it. But it's better to lose an arm or a leg than it is to bleed to death, right? But we know that that's not true. It's absolutely not true. Just because you put a tourniquet on somebody doesn't mean that they're going to have more damage than was already done. You will save their life. If you use a safely designed tourniquet and you apply it correctly, not only will you save a life, but you'll save a life without doing any additional harm. That flew in the face of the mantra that we had. And so when we rolled out things like tourniquets and pressure dressings and telling people to put needles in people's chest to decompress a big pocket of air that's interfering with their ability to breathe and the ability of their heart to move blood forward, you got to understand that was something that had never been done before. And we had to vet it first through the special operations community. And then as the big Army got more and more involved in combat operations, both in Afghanistan and then when the big push came in 2003 for the initial entries into Iraq, some of the big Army units had looked at this and said, hey, we think that there's something here. It kind of started as a grassroots effort, and it took many, 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 many years to get to where we are today with the concept of tactical combat casualty care.
So
complete new paradigm.
So pushing a needle into somebody's chest, that's a big step. It's something new. There's something hugely new for what we were doing at the time. Obviously, aside from finding the third and fourth rib, what are the technical skills that somebody needs to have to get to that point?
They need to have a mindset to understand that somebody's having trouble, right? And usually when you have that kind of an injury, you're going to be able to detect it because people will start breathing faster. And you have to be able to understand that there's a difference between I'm breathing fast because I just ran across an objective and got shot or took some shrapnel in my chest. There's a difference between that kind of breathing fast because you're partially volume depleted, you're carrying a heavy load, you just assaulted a couple of 100 meters, to, man, I'm having trouble breathing because there's something not right inside my chest. So you got to have, number one, the capability to understand something bad is going on. Number two, you have a capability to potentially do something about that. So not only do you have to have the training, you have to have the correct equipment. So you can tell somebody what a tension pneumothorax is, this pocket of air that's not supposed to be inside the chest, and you can tell somebody how they can fix it, but if you don't give them a simple needle, they can't do anything with it. Same thing if you give them a needle and say, hey, there's a big needle in your first aid kit. If somebody has trouble, just stick it in their chest. But you don't ever teach them where to do it or how to do it or why to do it. Now somebody pulls out this needle that's 3.5 inches long and they're scared to death. Like, I'm going to do this. I'm not sticking this in somebody's chest. It scares me. So you have to have the training and the equipping. It has to go simultaneously, and then people have to be trained that, hey, look, I don't care where you put a needle. I do care where you put a needle. If you put it in the wrong place, you can potentially do damage. But if something just ripped through your chest and you've got blood on that side of your chest and you're having trouble breathing, you can assume that it's one of these problems that you can potentially fix. And if I show you landmarks on a human being, that if you stay anywhere inside of these landmarks, you can't possibly do any more damage, stick that needle in there, all right? Because you can only potentially help somebody. So we have to give them a safety area. That's why telling somebody, if you're going to do a needle decompression, I know we're getting ahead of this thing. If you're going to do a needle decompression, it must be done in the second, third intercostal space of the midclavicular line. Well, that's one of those things that restricts people to understanding there's just one way to do things. Right. But if you give them a safety box that essentially goes from that second intercostal space all the way down to the fifth intercostal space in the midclavicular line, and you extend it laterally over to as far as the mid-axillary line and say, if you've got this big box right here, I'm going to draw it on your chest, I'm going to show you how to find it with your hand. If you put a needle somewhere in here for somebody that's already had something ripped through their chest, there is absolutely no way that you're going to do any additional harm to this casualty. Now, if you go inside that, closer to the middle of the chest where your breastbone is, guess what? That breastbone is there to protect some really important stuff. So don't stick a needle in that. Don't stick a needle down lower because you have no idea where some of these things are in your belly. If somebody has a disruption to their diaphragm, their liver is high riding, their spleen is up a little bit, if they have, they've just exhaled and now those abdominal organs are a little bit higher up because the diaphragm has relaxed. You stick a needle into somebody's liver or you stick a needle into somebody's spleen, you could probably do something that you didn't want to do and cause some additional harm. But if you stay in the safety zone, dude, you're just going to potentially help somebody.
So when y'all started the program, we're coming up with these new tactics. This is how we're going to do stuff. These are the procedures we're going to use. Did you find it was easier to start training the special operations guys just because of their ability to think at a different tempo, or did you find that did it lean more on the student or the instructor?
Well, it's both, right? So first, in order to convey knowledge, you have to have you have to have a knowledgeable instructor. You have to have a credible instructor. You can read a book and you can sit through a PowerPoint presentation and you can regurgitate that, but if you've never done it before, you can tell right off the bat. You can tell somebody who has not been through at least a scenario-based exercise, right? high threat environment, under the same type of load conditions, body armor, under limited visibility, with the limited kit that you have, with people yelling at you, hey, we got to move this casualty, how much time is it going to take you? You can tell the instructors that have that expertise and the instructors that have sat through a PowerPoint presentation and by virtue of sitting through a presentation have now been conferred as an instructor. Have to have really good instructors, and you have to have a receptive audience, right? So the person that you're trying to convey knowledge to, if they sit in the classroom and their arms are crossed and they're shaking their head and you just know that they're not accepting what you're telling them, it takes a lot to suspend their disbelief, and it takes a lot to train them in a different manner and provide them with education and information that they've either never been presented before or actually flies in the face of what they were presented with. So, in education, we talk about the principle of primacy. And when you learn something the first time, that's what you consider to be normal. And anything outside of that is abnormal. And if I'm teaching you something that is outside of your normal, now you have to, you really have to spend a lot of time to change from your old normal to a new normal. That's why it took so long to get tourniquets adopted. Even in the military sector, it took a long time to get tourniquets adopted. In the civilian sector, it took a long time and a lot of data compiled from the war effort until people started saying, hey, there's something to these tourniquets. I think they're safe. We should probably use these.
So how did you all decide on the first tourniquets we were going to use?
Wow, great question. At the time that TC3 first came out in 1996, the Department of Defense had a tourniquet. Okay, and I make the little air quotes here. So the first tourniquet was actually just a strap and buckle. This strap and buckle system, you were just supposed to put this strap through and pull it really tightly. There's no mechanical advantage to it. It absolutely didn't work. It was great to secure equipment down to the outside of a rucksack or to the outside of a vehicle, but as far as actual tourniquets go, it was completely useless. So there were some initial studies done prior to the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Guidelines being recommended that everybody have a tourniquet. And then shortly after that, there were some informal studies done, and there was another tourniquet that was brought out to at least to the United States Army, to their supply system. It was called the one-handed tourniquet. This one-handed tourniquet was wonderful. It was a series of nylon straps, and you would put it on somebody, and then you would pull it as tightly as you could. Again, no significant mechanical advantage. It was really narrow, and the unfortunate thing was, although it was a really great tourniquet, it didn't work. That means it's not a good tourniquet, right? So there were a couple of informal studies that were done. The Ranger Regiment and Special Operations were utilizing what we called improvised tourniquets because they weren't commercially made tourniquets, but they were very effective because we used them and we trained with them. And that was simply a cravat that we had pre-tied into a dowel rod windlass. You would tie that around somebody's extremity, twist that dowel rod windlass down until you got the desired effect, either the blood stop or the pulse to stop. Once you got that down, you secured the windlass, and there's plenty of photos of these devices that saved lives early on in the war. The Ranger Regiment decided early on that we wanted a commercially available product that we could train with. And since we couldn't find anything that really fit our bill, a guy by the name of Rob Miller, who was a very, very progressive, very intelligent medic, senior medic in the regiment, came up with the original Ranger ratchet. Because all Rangers know how to use a ratchet strap. That's right. How we secure our vehicles when we put them on aircraft. When we do things with our vehicles, we secure them. So everybody knows how to use that Ranger ratchet. Didn't take a lot of training. The only downside of the Ranger ratchet was two things. Number one, it was bulky and heavy, and number two, there was no defined endpoint. So the mechanical advantage on that was significant. But just like ratcheting down a vehicle, you would ratchet the vehicle down until it came to the bottom of the suspension travel. When you're putting it on as a tourniquet, you don't get a suspension travel stop, right? So right. These guys would put these things on, they get them cranked on tight, and then just to be sure, one for my Ranger buddy, one for the Ranger in the sky. Right?
So the cravat system, if everything went well for you, about how long did it take to get put on?
So our guys got very proficient with the cravat and sticks, right? But you're still talking about multiples of tens of seconds to a minute, because the task involved is you have to get it out, you have to put it around a limb, you have to tie the square knot securely before you can ever activate that windlass rod. And then when you're activating the windlass rod, no matter how tight you tie that thing, that strap, that cravat is only going to be so tight. So you have to take up the slack in your windlass rod, right? And so it requires quite a few twists in it.
So up to a minute on that one.
And so it would be a minute, a good minute to a minute and a half for a well-trained, well-experienced guy to get that on, to start a task when I first decide I'm going to put a tourniquet on this thing, to I have the tourniquet secured.
And then we go forward to the Ranger ratchet. What was the time frame? Like what was the difference in time putting those things on?
So the Ranger ratchet significantly shortened that time frame. Because all you had to do was tighten the strap and then click. So now you went to a system that would literally take multiples of tens of seconds. So if the cravat and stick would take you a minute, the Ranger ratchet would take 20 to 30 seconds tops.
And what's the standard? What are we teaching in TCCC or TECC? What are we teaching what's the recommended time to get a tourniquet on properly?
So there's an evaluation standard for the task, the individual task. And I'd have to go back, to be honest with you. There's so many things that I have in my head that I only have to memorize so many things. And if I memorize something else, something important might fall out of my brain housing group, like my wife's birthday, and then I'm going to be in real big trouble.
We're not going to have that.
So I'm not going to lie to you and make something up. But there's a time standard for that particular individual skill.
Right.
And that is only to assess that skill in an isolated setting, right? It has nothing to do with actual proficiency in the tactical world.
It's just a testing standard.
It's a testing standard to let you know whether or not you're proficient with that device.
And basically, in real life, what we're teaching is as soon as you realize there's a tourniquet needed, let's get the damn thing on.
Exactly.
Cool.
And you know what? There may be things that may preclude you from putting that tourniquet on, right? You might recognize right away that, this guy needs a tourniquet. But if the first thing is get him off of the X, you don't need to be putting a tourniquet on the X. You need to be moving him off of the X, or you need to be stopping the badness from happening before you start applying a medical solution to a tactical problem.
And that's one of the standards at ALERRT that we try to follow, is to stop the killing before we stop the dying. And there's two different focuses, and I think that's one of the things that people don't, I guess the civilian side doesn't realize, that that's one of the things that needs to be done. But yeah, we have to stop the bad guy before we can stop everybody from dying. So that's a great point to make. So going forward from the Ranger ratchet, what are the next improvements that we saw in tourniquets?
Okay. So we being Special Operations Community and the Army in general, called for a commercial solution. We wanted a device that was purpose-built. We wanted a purpose-built tourniquet. And so we put out a call for products, and this was probably 2003, 2004 timeframe. And a number of vendors sent us their concept for, this is the tourniquet that we would build, this is the tourniquet that we would make. And those were sent to the Institute of Surgical Research, who was conducting the research process at that time. And out of all the tourniquets that they had, that were sent to them, they down-selected 3 tourniquets out of that initial group. 2005, very few people were manufacturing tourniquets. Very few of the tourniquets actually worked for us. And so they down-selected 3 devices. 2 that were strap and windlass devices for the tactical environment, and 1 that was a pneumatic device that was to be used as a transition tourniquet when the tactical situation permitted. It wasn't rugged enough to be used in a far forward environment. So the 2 that we had at that time, the formal recommendations were the CAT tourniquet as the primary tourniquet. When that couldn't be obtained, then the soft T was advised to be the second tourniquet that was available. So those were the 2 tactical tourniquets, the CAT and the soft T. And that recommendation stayed and was a valid recommendation, as history would show us. Those two tourniquets performed extremely well. They did very well in a clinical testing. They both stopped bleeding 100% of the time. When we looked at them under the most austere of conditions, and Colonel John Craig, who is probably the foremost Department of Defense expert on tourniquets, did lots of research and published several papers on tourniquets. And he studied, at one point in time, he went to the Baghdad Combat Support Hospital and looked at every single casualty that came in that had a tourniquet and determined whether or not that tourniquet was effective. If it wasn't effective, why not, that kind of thing. And what we found was that for the tourniquets that started off in the testing world that were 100%, under duress, under the most hostile, adverse of conditions, they were still, 70 to 80% effective, applied by people, and we had no idea what their training level was. But just looking at the device and saying, did it work? Did it not work? That's a pretty compelling argument that these things were working well. Which is why we didn't study them anymore, because we had a solution that actually worked.
Well, it seems like I know everything revolves around data. In the real world, everything is proven by the data. So it seems like the data was right on this, because those two tourniquets still seem to be the industry leaders, and they seem to be consistent. They've improved over time, and we like that. I know that they work, so we've all had the chance to use them in operation. So thank God that they were there. So tourniquets have improved. Mm-hmm. What are the other big improvements or the big change that you've seen in pre-hospital medicine that have been the biggest impact?
First, it goes to training, right? Training and equipping down to the lowest level. All right, we've got to get out of the mindset that we see in Hollywood movies, where in a war footage, somebody gets injured, they fall they fall on the ground, rolling around, screaming medic, and a medic mysteriously appears at their side. In the big army in combat, what do we know? There's one combat medic for maybe every 20 to 50 combat soldiers, depending on the size of their unit. That's a pretty big objective area for one guy to have to run back and forth. And so if you don't enable people to take care of themselves or to take care of their buddies, you're not optimizing successful chances for them to have an optimal outcome. If you have to wait for somebody who's been dedicated in medicine only to get to your location, your trauma clock starts when something rips through your body. It doesn't start when the medic first kneels down beside you. It doesn't start when the ambulance delivers you to the trauma bay and the trauma surgeon puts his hands on you. Your clock of death has started when something disrupts your body. And that's where I think the biggest thing is to get that mindset out there that we need to be intervening. We need to be able to train people in the appropriate things that are appropriate for them to do. Let's look at these critical tasks. Of these critical tasks, what can we train to every individual? Then what do we train to dedicated people who have a little bit more medical knowledge? So your combat lifesavers in the Department of Defense. In the civilian world, that might be a couple of your tactical operators that you put through a little bit more dedicated program. They're not EMTs, they're not certified as EMTs or paramedics, but they have more dedicated medical training than, say, just your average operator. Then your medics, then your mid-level providers, your PAs, your nurse practitioners, whoever is going to be out there with you far forward, maybe not right there where the bullets are flying, but maybe a block away from where the bullets are flying, right? Your far forward providers, your physicians. And all of that has to be a team effort geared towards getting a casualty to a hospital where they have unlimited resources and they have unlimited people to help. So what are the things that we see that are actually making a difference in pre-hospital care? First of all, it's hemorrhage control, right? So it's the tourniquets. It's understanding how to do things that we traditionally didn't teach in civilian EMS, like how to pack a wound. So we want to get you to actually put stuff down inside that wound to help to help pack off that bleeding, to put pressure on the inside, instead of what we had taught for years in EMS, which is what I call hide the bleeding, right? You put a bunch of gauze on top of something until you've piled so much gauze on top of it, you just don't see the bleeding anymore. That doesn't mean that bleeding has stopped. It just means that you've hidden it very well, right? But if we actually stop just piling stuff on the surface and get it down into that wound, we can actually stop the bleeding instead of just hiding it. We can give you better bandages to pack down in there that actually have things that will help control arterial hemorrhage. You know, things like combat gauze, things like Kaido gauze, things like I'm blanking on the Celox gauze, right? I think even SAM has a new hemostatic agent. So better tourniquets, better hemostatic agents, better medications, understanding that there is a role for giving somebody antibiotics far forward to help prevent infection, understanding that there is a role for things like transamic acid, TXA, that can help in survivability for people who are bleeding.
Those were some of the questions I was going to have for you. So the actual medicine, the medicinal parts of it. Mm-hmm. What brought about such change? Because I know it was morphine. It was like morphine was the big thing everybody knew about, but ketamine and the TXA and everything's out there now. So
Sure.
How do we start studying these things?
Well, when you look at what our needs are, right? So let's talk about pain control. Okay, so pain control, the standard has been the standard was in the Army for years that we would use morphine, a medication that is for pain control. Morphine is a narcotic medication. It's an opioid medicine. So what are some of the side effects of opioid medicines? Well, they can release histamine. So when you release histamine, you can have that histamine type reaction. That's why people itch when they take any types of opioid medicines. Not necessarily an allergic reaction. It's a known side effect. Some of the other things that it can do is it can decrease in increasing doses. It can decrease your brain's respiratory drive, so it can make you start breathing slower and shallower. That may not be the best thing for a casualty who has lost a lot of blood and needs to have that respiratory drive going. It can cause your veins to dilate. And so when your veins dilate and your blood vessels dilate, you drop your core pressure. Dropping your pressure is not optimal in somebody who is already becoming hypotensive, losing enough volume that their blood pressure is lowering to a dangerous level. Let's not continue to lower it to a level where now they may not be able to perfuse those real important things that we need to be perfused, like your brain and your heart and your kidneys and your liver. And so just because something has been a standard for pain medicine in a operative suite since the Civil War, it doesn't necessarily mean that with the advent of technology, that should still be our same go-to medication in today's day and age for pain control in a pre-hospital environment. So ideally, what would we like to have in a pain control agent? We would like to have something that actually takes your pain away, right?
Right.
Something that could be easily administered and is safe, so that if I accidentally give you too much, it doesn't make you stop breathing and it doesn't make your blood pressure drop. It would be awesome if it didn't matter if I gave you the suggested dose of 50 milligrams, or if I gave you the whole vial because I was amped up on adrenaline and I just pulled up the whole thing and I gave you 500 milligrams. If the downside is it just takes you into a dissociated state for a while, but it doesn't drop your blood pressure and it doesn't interfere with your ability to breathe, I haven't done anything bad to you. I've just put you in a little bit more of a sedated state than I had intended to, but I still get pain control. Right? It should be a form that I can give in any number of ways. If I have to carry something in my limited resources in my aid bag, I would like to have something that I can give IV or intramuscular or intranasal or orally, and understand that depending on which route I choose to give this, I may have to give a little bit more or give a little bit less, but the effect will be the same. And at the end of the day, I want something that I can use just as safely in an adult population as I can in a child population, just in case we have to take care of collateral damage in a combat zone. And so when you look at that, that's not the world of opioid medicines. That's not the world of narcotics. Those all have some significant downsides when you're giving them in increasing doses, either IV or IM. And when you give an opioid through an intramuscular injection, in order for your body to actually be able to use that medicine, you have to absorb it. Well, in trauma, when you've lost a lot of blood, you may not be perfusing that particular muscle area that I just gave you a shot of a narcotic medication. You may not be perfusing it very well, so you might get a significant delay in the uptake of that medication. And so what do? I don't think it's working. I give you another shot. And so now you've got 2 shots sitting here not getting absorbed and not getting uptake. And eventually you're going to be resuscitated and you're going to have your volume replaced. And when your volume gets replaced and now you get perfusion of this and now all of a sudden you get a big release of this narcotic medication and you drop your blood pressure and you do all these things that you're not expecting, that can be a bad day for you.
Right.
But if I give you a medication that doesn't have any of that, and is probably the safest medication that has been used in a pre-hospital world for decades. We've used it safely in Western Europe in a pre-hospital environment for probably 30 years, and that's ketamine. Here in America, ketamine is a drug that was predominantly relegated to anesthesiology. We used it as procedural sedation in the emergency department for years and used it safely, but ketamine it's kind of like the tourniquet. When you tell people that ketamine is dangerous and scary and you don't allow nurses to give it and you don't allow medics to give it and you make doctors afraid of it, they don't get a familiarity with it. But the more that you read, the more that you understand the safety profile of this drug, the more that you understand that it's a dose-related phenomenon of this drug, that I can use it in lower doses and I can always give you more, you start to see that this is a very wise choice for people to use in an operating environment, because I can give you something and I don't have to put you on a monitor and I don't have to worry about all these other side effects. I can go on I just keep right on going, and guess what? You're getting some pretty good pain relief. And one of the things that Andy Fisher, who was our senior regimental PA in the Ranger Regiment for years, he's now a trauma surgeon. Congratulations, Andy.
Awesome.
He had actually gone back and looked at a lot of the casualties that we had given ketamine to. And what he discovered was that the degree and the incidence of post-traumatic stress for casualties that had received ketamine up front in those most horrible of circumstances was significantly decreased. And that could be for any number of reasons, not the least of which is we take them out of a situation with the way that drug works. We give them just a little bit of dissociation, and so they're not forming those horrible memories of having repeated trauma and repeated pain with people moving them around in the environment.
Right.
Maybe that does something to help with later on the effects of post-traumatic stress. So ketamine was that's how ketamine we came to discover that would be a great option. A guy by the name of now see, this is my TBI again. John Gandy from Tactical Combat Casualty Care. He took up the responsibility for doing all the research and researching the papers and putting together the presentation that we brought to the Assistant Secretary of Defense at the time to get approval for special operations to use ketamine. When we proved within the special operations community that it could be done safely and it was the right thing to do and the outcomes were getting better, then it got approved for the rest of the conventional force.
So are all these products, there's so many products out there, and I'm not really sure how they work. My time in medical school was real short, so they saw me there and they ran me off. But and that was at Harvard. So are these all products that can be, can they be carried by the individual soldier, or is this something that has to be administered by the medic himself? And are these things that exist in a preload or like an auto-injector type of format?
So with ketamine, the answer is no.
Okay.
Ketamine is still a medication. As much as we'd like to have it in a pre-dosed format, particularly something that you could just squirt up somebody's nose real easily. That's the greatest way to do it.
Wow.
You still have to draw it up. Can we train people who are not medical people to draw up and use these kinds of medications? Yes, you can. You can train somebody to do anything. You just have to have You just have to have a good education program. You have to have a good training program. Then you have to be able to validate that they are proficient with the education and training, and then you have to have a way of sustaining it. So are there times when we might give ketamine to a smaller group of operators that does not have a medic embedded in with them because the size of their unit precludes, they can only take 3 or 4 guys on a mission. If they can only take 3 or 4 guys on a mission and they don't have a trained up, tactical medic to go with them, then it's these 3 or 4 tactical guys. Could we give them something like that if we trained one of them to do that? Absolutely. Absolutely, we could do it. But you can't just give something to somebody and say, hey, this is great. If you need it, just draw up to this line and give it to somebody. That is fraught with problems.
Sure.
But you have to have a way, because it is a controlled medication. You just have to have, if you're here in the United States, you have to follow all the rules for keeping control of all of your controlled medications. And as long as you follow those rules and have a good program for all of that, you can avoid diverting this stuff. There should not, operative word there should not be a problem with that.
Sure. Accountability, I think accountability is probably the biggest thing that I guess validates any program or keeps it going or shuts it down. If you have bad accountability, that's where things go away. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got products we're talking about. The question pops up about policies and policymakers and how do we get policies changed? Where have been the biggest problems that you've seen on the military side versus the civilian side? Because now you've dealt with both sides. Mm-hmm. What do you see as the biggest problems with policy making or policy changing?
Okay. So to start on the Department of Defense side, I will tell you it's easy and it's difficult, right? It's difficult because there's usually one decision maker that has to have that has the ultimate approval authority, whether it's the Secretary of Defense, the Assistant Secretary of Defense. It could be relegated down to the Surgeon General. It could be one of the tactical commanders. It could be the Chief of Staff of the Army. Somebody has the authority to say, this makes sense, we're going to do it. It was properly staffed, it was properly vetted, I understand the risks and benefits, this is execute, okay? And the benefit of the military is not only having that one decision maker, but the benefit is the Department of Defense is one entity. So there's one standard, right? It doesn't matter if you're at Fort Campbell, it doesn't matter if you're at Fort Bragg, doesn't matter if you're at Fort Drum, doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you're in, there's one standard. And so we can train to that one standard because the Department of Defense is one entity. So like, for example, the United States Army has the Army EMS program that oversees all of the training for all of the combat medics. It's difficult in that if you don't get the right person or you don't have the right briefing format, if you don't get that decision maker to commit, then it becomes more of a grassroots effort to make things happen the right way. And it's always better. It's always better to have the decision maker say, this is what you're going to do, than have a bunch of people trying to pull that decision down from the decision maker. On the civilian side, the unfortunate thing is you don't have just one national standard. So even say in training for the National Registry of Paramedics, just because you're NREMT certified, depending on what state you're in, you may have to do a state certification as well. They may not accept that as, okay, this is acceptable because our state does things differently and better. Great that you're National Registry certified, but you have to do this program. You have 50 different states operating under 50 different state medical directors, and those state medical directors then down at the local. There are so many different layers that there's not one person overall responsible for an overall program, because you don't want the federal government to step in and say, okay, this is how we're going to do things. Our Constitution just doesn't allow for the federal government to overstep its bounds and say, this is exactly the standard and this is how we're going to do things in this particular environment. It's still up to the individual states to decide what those best practices will be. And they're only going to be enabled to do that as best as those decision makers understand what the risks are and how to mitigate those risks and how to do it safely.
Okay, cool. So you brought up a word that's very fond, or I'm very fond of, your standards. How do we set standards and all that stuff? I know about my standards, I know what my standard is. But how do we set standards for the medical world? Because obviously, like you said, the Constitution prevents us from doing, and it's a good thing. It's set up the right way. But if we can set up a template and Jeff Cain's declared the medical president of the world. How do we set up a template? What standards do you set, or what processes do you come up with personally? Do you think we can come up with to set up a template? Who do you go to help you set standards?
Okay, that's a great question. All right, so when you look at what we consider to be an acceptable standard, there are several things that we call the gold standard, right? So, for example, for trauma in a hospital environment, for people who are not primarily trained in trauma, and believe it or not, there are very many smaller hospitals that have people who are not actual, trauma surgeons. They don't have actual board residency trained and board certified emergency medicine staffing them. There are some small hospitals that have that. There is a program out there that helps people understand how to approach trauma in a very standardized fashion. It's called the Advanced Trauma Life Support Program, ATLS. That is recognized by a board of experts, the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma, as the standard program for how you will approach managing a trauma patient in a hospital if you are not primarily trained, not primarily residency trained, not primarily board certified in one of the trauma management specialties. That's a gold standard, okay? And that came about from, the committee looking at best practices, taking as much as we can from data-driven outcomes and saying these are the things that actually can save lives until we can fix the problem in the operating room. How do we do that in the tactical world? It's difficult, but it's not impossible. And so we can look at those things that are data-driven. One of the things that is very difficult to overcome right now is the fact that we just simply don't have a good national database for trauma. There's not a national database that allows us to do the deep dive into best practices, what's worked, what's not worked, how are people dying, where's their potential for intervention before they die, what are the skills and the tasks that can be done. If we had all of the agencies feeding that into one thing like we do in the Department of Defense, we have the Joint Theater or the Joint Trauma System, the JTS. The JTS looks at every single casualty, whether it's in a training environment or whether it's in a hostile combat situation. They collect the data from every single one of these, and they look at where were the opportunities that could have saved somebody's life. Was it a earlier intervention of an application that we already have? Do we need a different device? Do we need a different medication? And how do we make things better so that we don't have that same injury repeating itself, time and time and time again? There is a little bit of a national database, but it's not as refined as we need it to be able to do that deep dive specifically for trauma to look at how we can intervene in timely decisions.
So it seems like having the data available and having a national database, having database available to whether it's the military side or the civilian side, collecting numbers is very important.
It is.
That seems to be the way to build programs. So speaking of programs, there's been programs that have been developed along the way. I think the old school standard, everybody knew that there was a Navy corpsman and the PJs were always the guys to go to if somebody you were hurt, you wanted the PJ on you. So now the Army developed the 18 Delta School, and I think the SEALs have a SEAL medic program now. So if we got into a medical fight and the old Navy corpsmen and the PJs and the 18 Deltas and the SEAL medics got into a big medical fight, who's the best medic?
Well, the best medic is the medic that can operate the most effectively under any set of circumstances and optimize the outcome for their particular casualty. And so I would tell you that, as an Army guy, right, I would tell you that the Special Operations Army guys are the approved solution just because that's my bias. Sure. However, you have to look at each particular environment and what each particular specialty brings to the mix. So when you're dealing with certain types of challenges, closed space confinement, one of the most challenging, stressful exercises I ever had was trying to get a casualty from the bottom of a ship up to the top of a ship where we could get them then to a place where we could get a helicopter in to evacuate them. Okay, it's not my world. I've never ever operated that way until I was put on that ship in the Navy shipyard. Say, hey, there's a casualty, make it happen, and it makes you understand that, hey, this is not my environment, and it takes a while to figure out the best practices to do that. Who would be better to take a casualty out of a ship? Probably a Navy corpsman, right? That's their world. That's what they train in. Who's probably best suited to doing combat search and rescue, downed aircraft, getting not only the casualties out of the aircraft crash site, but then making sure that everybody's accounted for. PJs, that's what they do, right? They do that very, very well. So if you want to talk about expertise in search and rescue, I'd start with the PJs, right? Now, if you want to talk about dedicated, high threat, high stress environments right at the point of injury, now you're probably looking more at the guys that are from the Special Warfare School out of Fort Bragg, looking at those medics' capabilities, because that's what they do. And all of us rotate through the same courses, right? It's just where we focus the majority of our effort. And so it's, when you look at all of the programs all together, look at the pieces that you need to fit your operational requirements.
So they call from Hollywood, and we're going to make a movie about Jeff Cain's life. Who plays Jeff Cain in this movie?
My wife would tell you Tom Hanks.
All right.
Probably closer to Forrest Gump than in Saving Private Ryan, right? But I don't know. I don't get wrapped up in that stuff, to be honest with you.
I love to throw stumpers out there.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm not egotistical enough to think that. Oh my God. Oh, definitely Chris Hemsworth, because you're one of those big strapping
We're built
guys.
the same, right?
Yeah, we're so close, except we're completely different.
So along the way, you've had a lot of instructors. You've taught a lot of medics along the way. Who are the guys that you've come across that stood out to you as instructors, or the guys that you saw operationally that stood out? Is there any people out there that you can recall right off the bat that made an impact to you?
Absolutely. Probably the person that made the biggest impact on me was a PA, Don Parsons. Don started off, as a young man as a Special Forces medic, and then was afforded the opportunity to do the PA course, and was an Army PA for years in special operations, and eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel and ran the PA program down in Fort Sam Houston for the Army until he retired. When he retired, we were fortunate enough to get him as a civilian to come to the Army Combat Medic Schoolhouse. And he was one of those guys that, he really understood operational medicine and tactical medicine, was one of the first guys to understand tactical combat casualty care, and really helped me understand, even with coming out of the Ranger Regiment, it's one thing to have a lot of resources that you can commit to training and to executing, and then when you're constantly engaged in combat operations, you can solidify all of those things. It's another thing entirely to understand all of these fundamental principles and then be able to replicate that for the rest of the conventional Army that doesn't have the same resource availability as far as time and expertise to train these guys. But Don's probably forgotten more about tactical medicine than I could ever hope to know. But he's also one of those guys that just insists that if you're going to be an instructor, it's not enough for you to sit through a course and then teach the course that you just sat through. There needs to be a dedicated instructor development program, because the instructors, they have to know the why, not just the how. Your students have to know the how. Right. They might at some point be interested in the why, but right now they have to know how to do stuff. Your instructor has to be able to explain to them and be able to answer their questions. And if you get an instructor that looks at, I'll have to look that up. What do you mean you have to look that up? This is something you should know. Now, if you get one of these wazoo questions about, well, how does this interfere with the Krebs cycle? Well, you know what? I'll look that up because it's not important. But if you're talking about something like, well, exactly how does combat gauze work to stop bleeding? How does that different than chitosan? How does ketamine work? And why doesn't it drop your blood pressure? If your instructor doesn't know that kind of stuff, then they probably are not the subject matter expert that they believe that they are, and they probably need to do a little bit more self-study and make sure that they not only understand the how of the principles, but the why of the principles.
Is there a class that stands out in your training that you enjoyed the most? And was it a medical class or was it an operations class?
Well, it was both.
All right.
So tactical medicine, when we talk about tactical medicine is a program that's intended to help tactical commanders. It's not a hospital commander. Hospital commanders aren't practicing this kind of stuff. The tactical commander has to understand what risk a casualty plays for his overall operation, whether that's one of his force that goes down or whether it's collateral damage. But there's a risk that that a casualty plays, and it depends on where you are in that operation. If he understands the risk, then he can put into place those things that can mitigate that risk. And a casualty is a tactical problem that requires a part of that solution to that tactical problem is a medical application, okay? And so probably the one course that I really enjoyed the most was back when I was a medical student. I was afforded the opportunity to take a course called OEMS, Operational Emergency Medical Skills. When I took it, it was a great course. It exposed me to a lot. Not only did it expose me to a lot of concepts that I hadn't learned yet in medical school, but dude, I was taking classes. There were SAS medics there were Ranger medics there were a couple of 18 Deltas and a couple of SEALs there, all taking the same class. And so I'm listening to these guys who are actually out there doing stuff in the field, and I'm getting to learn from these guys how they did things, and it's starting to make those gears in my mind turn of, hey, I might be getting this opportunity to get education, and I might have a medical degree, but these are the guys that are making stuff happen on the ground, and these are the ones that I need to make sure that I'm soliciting their input when we have to make choices about how we're going to do training. The OEMS course was good. There was nothing else like it at the time. I think that it got a little bit sidetracked, and it subsequently developed a very bad reputation, and I don't even know if they're even doing that course anymore. But when I took it, it was eye-opening and refreshing to me.
Awesome. All right, so I'm trying to be respectful of your time, and I'm going to try not to hold you here for too long, but I don't want to let you go without asking you about this, because I know we're here at the Tactical Police Officers Association conference, and there's great cops out there, great vendors out there, great medics out there. Everybody's got a question. And how do we set up our own medical program in our agency? My police department doesn't have a medical director. How do we go about it? What's the first step? Now, obviously, you're the medical director for ALERRT, and all it takes is to look at the bios. And we've been fortunate to find guys like you along the way. What's the number one step that you would recommend for somebody trying to set up their own medical program?
Man, Eddie, that is such a great question. And a question that I've fielded so many times. I think it's time that we need to be proactive and give people a tool. Because right now I don't think there's an adequate tool for people to go to look at what their needs are. So if we can build a tool that will help people understand what their needs are and what their requirements are, you should build a program around your requirements. You shouldn't just take bits and pieces of programs that you've heard of and try to make that fit your role. That's a bad thing. That's what the Army did for years, and it didn't work. If you want true capability, if you want true risk mitigation, then we need to look at you as an individual program, because every program is going to have its individual needs. A county sheriff is going to have a different operational requirement than, say, a full-time SWAT team in an urban metropolitan area. Guys, patrol cops operating on the south side of Chicago probably have a different operational requirement than our patrol guys in McKinney, Texas. And so we shouldn't be arrogant enough to think that there's going to be a one-size-fits-all and everybody must bow to the altar of this program or you're just doing things wrong. So I've just taken it on myself after answering that question this morning for another tactical officer. And I was talking to you about this earlier. I'm going to take this on as a mission for myself. I'm going to try to come up with a program, or at least a guideline for how to develop this as far as a requirements-based program. Put it somewhere on the ALERRT site. We're going to vet this through a number of other pre-hospital providers who've had a lot of experience in the tactical world. Make sure that this makes sense. We'll put it somewhere where then everybody can have access to it, and then we can start soliciting input. How do we make it better? How would this work for you? And if we get enough input and enough data and we can find things that are evidence-based that support it, or sometimes it's best evidence-based, and sometimes it's just a collective group of well-intentioned people that have been doing this with a lot of experience to say, no, this is really what works in this environment, then we can put together hopefully a guideline where it will help you. If you don't have a program, these are some of the things that we should be looking for in a program. These are the requirements that we will need from a medical director. These are the requirements that we will need for our individuals. These are the kinds of equipment investitures that we will need to make and resource investitures that we'll need to make as far as time and equipment and training. And have that as a framework that people can go and say, okay, let's see, I'm a small municipal department. I have 7 officers. Let's see, I probably don't need this full up, I don't need all these full up programs, but what I do need is maybe a subcomponent that's closer to a stop the bleed, or what is the best thing that my officers can be trained to do that could mitigate risk for not only my organization, but my community that I'm responsible for.
Awesome. I appreciate that, and I think it's a very important mission for us to tackle. Well, for you to tackle, because I'll just be here helping you document stuff. But you hit on one thing earlier, and when we were talking about the medicines, and you talked about the actual victim, not the wounded person, not suffering through multiple phases or constantly reliving the pain, and how that would possibly have some impact on PTSD. So the big things that people talk about right now are mental health and resiliency. So how do you feel what do you think the impact is of teaching people better medicine? What do you think the impact is on the mental health side and the resiliency side? How does better medical training impact that?
Great question. And I think that the answer to that is resiliency comes through proficiency and experience, right? So the more that you're exposed to things, especially the most horrible things that humans can do to each other, the more that you're able to absorb that and understand what your role is in trying to fix this, okay? And I'll give you a perfect case in point. All humans are experiential learners, and we learn through the experiences that we have. You can try to learn from reading of other experiences and looking at lessons learned and applying those, but you really don't get it until you experience it. And so the more that you can do in training, the more that you can do really scenario-based, very intense scenario-based training, the more hyper-realistic that you can make it, the better off that becomes. As a physician, as an ER physician, as a resident, and then as a practicing attending, I've seen some pretty bad traumas, right? I've been exposed to some pretty significant stuff, and I've seen bodies in various states of dismemberment, unfortunately. And over time, I've become desensitized to that, and I'm able to separate the stuff that I'm seeing in front of me, being able to separate that from my mind and saying, this is really, really horrible, oh my God, to, okay, what do I need to do? Let's make sure the bleeding's controlled, let's make sure he's breathing correctly, let's make sure all of these things are going in kind of an algorithm, and then I can decompress at a later time. But right now, I don't have time to take a knee and shake my head and shake the cobwebs out of my head. I've got to execute. one of the first coalition casualties that we had in Afghanistan took a pretty significant explosive force to the front, pretty much dismembered. Okay, and I grabbed one of my senior medics who, through my unconscious bias, I had just assumed that with as much hyper-realistic training as we have done, with as much of the live modeling that we have done in training these guys, that he was pretty much at the same level of desensitization as I was. So I was taking him through the steps that you have to do to actually declare death. And when we opened up the remains bag and were doing the actual declaration for this member, I looked up and I realized that he wasn't speaking to me anymore. He was just pale white and sweating. And I was like, "Johnny, you okay?" It's like, "Sir, I'm like, just, all right, why don't you just go outside? I'll finish up here and I'll come talk to you later." He'd never really, even through all the training, he'd never been exposed to a comrade that, yesterday we were having lunch with, and today we're processing him and making a declaration of death. And that really shook him. And it made me realize that no matter how much we do these kinds of things, it's still situational dependent. But the hyper-realistic training, the more that you can desensitize somebody to the badness, the more that they're able to cope with it. The downside to this is tactical medicine is always different than just pre-hospital medicine in the United States. When you're a paramedic, you roll out on a call, unless you have family that live in the area or you've got a lot of friends in the area, generally you're going to a call and it's a chest pain, right? It's a traffic accident. It's a attempted suicide. It's whatever it is. It's not somebody that you know. When you're a tactical provider, this is the guy that you just went to their kid's birthday party. You just were watching the Super Bowl with them drinking a beer. Just a couple months ago. And now this is somebody you know very well, and you're working, and that's the thing that goes in the back of a lot of medics' minds is, this is my friend, and if I do something wrong, he's not going to survive because of what I did. And that's a big part of resiliency for our medical providers, is how do you help build that resiliency? You help build it through training and education, understanding that you can do everything right, and somebody still might not survive it. But the more that you build this in, that I am confident that I did everything that I could and I did it right, he just didn't survive, that helps a lot. They don't have that lingering survivor's guilt afterwards of, oh man, what if I would have done this? Or what if I gave him this medication? Or what if I would have done this? What if I would have reversed the order that I addressed this in and actually done a surgical crike on this guy before I put the tourniquet on? Would he have lived? They'll what if each other to death, and you just have to help them through that to really work through that, dude, you did, or now it's not even just dude, it's, it's whoever. It's like, look, you did everything that you could have done. You did more than I would have thought to have done. And sometimes people just have a bad outcome.
Casey, you have anything you want to ask the doc?
No, Eddie, I think you did a great job. Just to quote the doc, those were really good questions that you
Awesome.
asked. So nicely done.
Awesome. Doc, you have any closing thoughts?
Hey, this is tactical medicine. It's continuing to evolve. There's not one right way to do things, but there are best practices. And hopefully we being ALERRT, we being some of the national organizations like the Committee for Tactical Emergency Casualty Care, hopefully we're giving people some tools and resources that they can either use as standalone, or they're resources that will open pathways to ask questions to other subject matter experts. I'm not the know-all, be-all, end-all, do-all. I am one person that was just unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, but fortunate enough to have a lot of great experience and a lot of great opportunities, mostly provided for the taxpayer. And now my responsibility is to pay that back and hopefully provide a better training education process for the rest of the community, because we're all about how do we continue to get better? How do we continue to evolve? how do we continue to stop the dying?
Awesome. Well, great. Well, can't thank you enough for taking time coming down here. And I know you've been working all night, but thank you very much for your time and your info and your direction over our program. Casey?
Thanks, everybody. Eddie, great job. Doc Cain, we really appreciate you being here. For information on ALERRT, visit alert.org. It's ALERRT.org. And for information about the podcast, you may email us at thecall@alert.org. Thank you very much. Thanks for watching and listening, or just listening. And we are out. Fade to black.